All right, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, I'd like to start. I've got so much I want to talk to you about, but I'd really like to start because I'm intrigued about how the UFO subject kind of first came into your life.
Yeah, so I was a physics nerd growing up. I was, I'd say since 10 or 11, my ambition was to get a PhD in physics, become a theoretical physicist, et cetera. So I was always interested in kind of these off the wall sorts of concepts and ideas, and so I had a range of different sort of esoteric readings as a middle schooler, you could say. And one of those books was The Hunt for Zero Point, and so that was, I'd say, the closest I got in my formative years to this subject. But of course, UFOs were obviously in the ambiance, right, in the sort of pop culture lore. But I had always assumed, and kind of my orientation towards it was as secret government projects on breakthrough physics and science, et cetera. Skunk works, and that was sort of what intrigued me about it. And then I went off to school and grad school, and then got a job, and never really touched it, firsthand, and never really thought about it that much more until 2017. And then I just had a certain sort of spidey sense reading the New York Times articles, and at the time I had been doing a number of classified work for the government. Nothing that touched UAPs, but I was involved in a range of different classified programs and sort of emerging technology, as well as sort of continuity of government. So I kind of, something about that story piqued my interest, and so I just started paying more attention to it, and then just started tracking it more and more. Right, and so 2020, 2021, the things that really, I'd say, perked my interest to like another stair step was the National Defense Authorization Act, that first included explicit reference to these to UAPs. And you started having like the more formal mechanisms of the government, so the bureaucracy starts to move. It's an iceberg, or it's a there's an iceberg, but there's also like an ocean liner sort of inertia to it. And I just kind of knew from the inside of the government kind of how those sorts of things work, and I just knew that doesn't just happen kind of on a one-off. Like there's a lot that's usually behind that's finally reaching the surface. So that kind of gave me more and more sense that there's something substantial here, and that has only just sort of, I'd say, cascaded exponentially in those years since.
Amazing. No, it's fascinating. And recently it's become quite clear because you've done a lot of sort of interviews that you've kind of made some really good connections, within the field. And was that something planned? Did you want to get more embedded into the subject rather than just be kind of on the outside looking in?
No, it's been really, I'd say, weird, kind of a Truman Show, where kind of I developed kind of a sort of a small Twitter account in COVID, and I would just sort of tweet about the things I was interested in. At the time, it was basically philosophy, national security, Bitcoin, and UAPs. And I had like 200 followers, and so it was just kind of like me just spewing into the void. And I grew kind of a broader following, and I think it actually started with the Bitcoin community bringing me onto podcasts, and I had a foot there because I was writing and doing a lot of policy analysis on the intersection of digital assets and national security and geopolitics, kind of the what if these things tend to continue to grow and monetize, and be adopted at a global level. And so I would have these side conversations recording with these Bitcoin guys, and I'd sort of like riff on the UAP stuff with them, and then they'd be like, okay, well, you should ask, can you talk about that next time we bring you on the podcast? And so I'm like, all right, sure. I'll just riff and spew about my UAP thoughts on these Bitcoin podcasts. And then I think a bunch of UAP people, happen to see some of those podcasts, and then we're like, hey, you have thoughts about UAPs. Those are interesting. Like, come on to my podcast. And it's like, all right, sure. Like, I'll spew about whatever you want. Right. And that's kind of literally just how it happened. And then I had some sort of, I had some professional connections, some personal connections, sort of folks that are, most of them are not public about their interest in UAPs, but they're senior journalists or folks that have sort of at high level positions, and we had sort of small group discussions on all the interesting things happening in the world, and UAPs were one of them. And so we were just kind of sort of asking the questions to each other about what we thought was happening. This was several years ago, and some of those people had more, I'd say, decisively tried to figure out what was going on, and they had their own personal connections to try to suss it out. And then they eventually introduced me to the people they were talking to, and I've adopted this principle of like always say yes to a meeting. If somebody wants to introduce you to somebody, I'm like, sure, like I'm not going to go into some dark alley or get myself blindfolded into the desert. Like like Ross Coulthard is. But yeah, I've been just sort of willing to kind of follow the yellow brick road, so to speak, and just keep saying yes to people when they offer to introduce me. And those have just kind of, I guess, compounded, right? Like it turns out like there's not that many people that are paying attention to this like several years ago, especially folks that are professionally have a professional like reputation. And I guess for whatever reason I just didn't care all that much. And so I was like willing to take these things seriously, and kind of stretch the Overton window a bit in my public discussions of these subjects. And that I guess allowed me to kind of develop some high trust relationships. And now I've gotten to the point where I don't know, enough people feel like I'm acting in good faith. I don't have like an agenda. I'm not here, scheming or whatever. Like I'll try to act as a sounding board or just to give my perspective on what's happening, because I think it's extremely complicated. And I'm not sure anyone really has like a fully fleshed out sense of what's happening here, or the implications of it in all of its different manifestations. So I think it's about time we have, we take a serious look at this question. We sort of shake the taboo loose, and we bring people from all these different professional perspectives and academic perspectives to the table.
Completely. Yeah. I like how grounded you are in that, and you do seem so open and honest about it. And that really sort of stands out. So no, I appreciate that. Now, unfortunately, earlier this week, we learned about the passing of Harold Malmgren, and I believe you said you'd actually spoken to him. And, I know there was a lot of people really wanting to speak to him and sort of dig into his knowledge of this subject and if what he worked on, in his history, quite a prominent figure. Can you able to tell us about anything you spoke with him about or anything like that?
Yes, that was a real tragedy. I think it was definitely a man who lived a singular life. And I think all the details of his life story have yet to be told, and I think should be told, and I think will be told. It was an honor to speak with him. Pippa, who I've developed a close relationship with, she's been taking care of him. Obviously, he suffered from a number of medical issues in the final stages of his life. And so I think it was a real unique opportunity that I was able to kind of get to have a lunch with both of them last year. And it was really just me listening and trying to understand some periods of his life that are somewhat unique, right? When he was very young, 27, sort of being tapped by the Kennedy administration to go to the Pentagon to essentially try to like hold Curtis LeMay back from launching a nuke or dropping a nuke, as the case may be, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he described some of that in more detail, and the color commentary around this young, somewhat brainy kid being thrust into this smoke-filled room down in the bowels of the Pentagon with a bunch of these Air Force generals and senior officers with fully loaded sidearms, basically doing planning and active operations to prepare for like World War III. And his task was to stall, right? And so it was interesting to see here what his tactic was to try to stall. Like, how do you do that when you're 27, right? And he, it was like how to ask questions that are like formally kind of in the bureaucracy. Like the military still has a structure, still has plans, and they have procedures. And you're gonna like, well, you want to drop a nuke? Well, where? Right? Where do you want to drop it? Right? Here or here or here? Well, now you need to do a study, right? You need to figure out, do you actually have the right fuel? Do you have the right munitions? What is the, and so he was just kind of constantly sort of asking, using the bureaucracy to kind of stall, right? And then let the political process play out, and did that, with aplomb. And so that was really, really, I think, a unique kind of historical case study of how contingent some of these very fraught geopolitical moments really are, and how close civilization has come to catastrophe, and how it's the right people being at the right place at the right time that allows us to still be here, essentially. So that was, you hear these stories, you read about, versions of that throughout the Cold War, but rarely do you get sort of first person testimony that's like, this is what it's like, right? I've been through some stressful situations in my life, but I can't imagine anything that's like that stressful. And yeah, he just had a very unique life. He was exceptionally brilliant as a young man. And I was, we didn't get to his full biography, right? But stepping back, looking at the course of his career, you get a sense of like almost providence associated with his life, right? That he was in these places talking with these people, and in a position always to kind of do what he felt was in the public interest, in the public good. That, you know, there are some other folks that he was around, right, and that sort of swam in the same circles as he did, like Dr. Kissinger, that were very much, you know, oriented towards self-promotion and making their names be the names that are written in the history books. And Dr. Malmgren was the exact opposite. He did not care for the limelight, did not care for the notoriety or the attention, or the historical, kind of notoriety. But he was, you know, equivalent in terms of his level of influence and access and trust by multiple presidents over the course of the Cold War, and you know, I think shaped history to a large extent more than most, you know, non-elected officials. And so, you know, I think he had a number of insights, perspectives on UAPs, which, you know, I really applaud his, you know, when you reach retirement, you just want to chill out, go to the beach, read a book, you know, and this guy was on Twitter, you know, just dropping bombs, right? Every other week, it seemed. And to have someone with his pedigree and his bona fides and his intelligence come out and say, you know, in no uncertain terms, right? Like these specific examples of talking with senior officials like Lawrence P. Geist at the Atomic Energy Commission, or Richard Bissell, the CIA, about other world technologies and UAP retrievals from back, you know, as early as the early 60s. You know, hangs a lot of meat on the bone, right? I mean, again, these are all firsthand anecdotes coming out of, you know, the long arc of history. But I think it helps where we are now. We're going to have to look back at that period of history with a new perspective. So I think it is tragic that we lost him, you know, before potentially, you know, the conversation takes this turn in more explicit fashion. I think hopefully there'll be some artifacts, some records of his accounting of some of this information that will hopefully come out soon. So I think this isn't necessarily the last word from Dr. Malmgren that's been recorded for posterity. But unfortunately, yeah, we won't be able to get him live. Wouldn't also note that he did meet with Senator Rounds, yes, just before he passed. I think it was a few weeks, maybe even, that he had a meeting with Senator Rounds. So yeah, I think, you know, he did his part, you know, more than most. Now that hopefully the baton is passed to other senior folks to maybe take this lesson, right? Like that, you know, if you've got something to say, you know, follow his example and, you know, don't be shy.
Of course, yeah, he certainly lived the life, and I think you know, a lot of people stood up and took notice when he started talking about UAPs on X. And so I was just going to say there, I believe Jesse Michaels in the last couple of days has stated that he did meet with him, and he's going to be doing a project, so maybe some sort of interview will be coming out, and I think that'll be great to hear it from him on video rather than just reading these sort of shortened tweets and that. So that'll be interesting. So yeah. You know, rest in peace to him, and thoughts with his family and Pippa. So thank you for that. Now, you work in national security, and I've noticed a lot in the last few years, probably since the 2017 article, that when UAP and national security are brought together in the conversation, there are a lot of people out there that seem to not kind of like that combination. Could you talk to the importance of why national security is important when it comes to secrecy and not just letting it all like rush out with all this information that we potentially have on UAP?
Yes, I mean, there's probably versions of that answer that are somewhat banal and expected, right? Like there are certain sets of secrets that are inherently government property, right? Like the government, you know, and especially democratic form of the government has to strike a balance between, you know, being accountable to the public, you know, doing things in a transparent fashion, but recognizing it's a competitive geopolitical environment. You don't just tell every person on the planet what your capabilities are, right? So you have sources and methods that you keep secret, you know, in the interest of securing the common defense, right, which is a core constitutional responsibility of our democratic form of government. And we've seen examples of where that line is pushed and sometimes broken. But it's an important distinction. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as secrets, but it means the secrets have to be justified and ideally, right, in the sense, fully transparent to certain members of Congress that are cleared and that are in a position of respecting the public trust and holding executive branch accountable. And so I think that's where this subject is very fraught because on the one hand, you could make an argument that some folks inside the quote legacy program that, put it upon their own shoulders and maybe refer to executive orders from decades past as the justification for keeping this secret. The relationship between, say, fundamental physics and world-winning capabilities was, proven to everybody in 1945. And that lesson is not something I think the government just forgot about. And I would expect them to sort of, take that lesson to heart and institutionalize mechanisms to ensure that dangerous knowledge, didn't just proliferate throughout the world, especially knowledge that could result in weapons of mass destruction. So that's the responsibility of the government, right? I think that's a prudent posture for those agencies to take. But of course, that can always go too far, right? It's a matter of drawing the healthy line. And I think the folks on the Hill and the folks that are coming out of these programs as whistleblowers are pointing out sort of breaches of that public trust, breaches of that implicit social contract between proper demarcation of secrecy and the social contract in a democracy. And so that's it gets more difficult, right, when you start to touch on what the nature of the subject that we're keeping secret actually is, right? And like the typical line is basically fact of non-human intelligence is just a fact of nature. That's not inherently government information. The government can't, put that fact in a security classification guide and say this is top secret information because it's not government property, right? It's not government information. It doesn't derive, it itself isn't a source or method of the U.S. government. It's just it's like the existence of the moon, right? Or the existence of gravity, right? These things I think are not, things the government can legally or even ethically classify. But then there's a line of like derived knowledge, derived capabilities that have resulted in, weapons platforms or intelligence surveillance or reconnaissance platforms or other sorts of sensor capabilities that, the U.S. government needs to have to maintain strategic deterrence and overmatch against its rivals on the earth. and that is, a prudent, I think you have to, everyone has to draw a certain line, but I think that's acceptable to me, right? That the U.S. government, I do want to make sure has capabilities that China doesn't have or Russia doesn't have. And that if there is actually a conflict that we can ensure, Western liberal systems prevail. But I don't think it's fair to sort of, and I think this has been an unfortunate aspect of the secrecy, is to sort of so stitch those two sets of facts together that they're like Siamese twins. And therefore to almost use the national security argument as like a human shield to prevent disclosure of the non-human intelligence. And then usually then the fallback, if that is sort of, accepted, is that actually, no, it's the very knowledge of the non-human intelligence being real, that's too disruptive to society. And therefore the government has an interest in holding some knowledge back in sort of the interest of the public good, because, they have to ensure social stability and they don't want to just throw a grenade into people's religious or economic system, et cetera. That's a bit trickier, right? From an ethical basis, right? We expect the government not to just blow the system up, right? For the sake of it, not to sort of destabilize the foundations of its own legitimacy, which could be a risk, if the disclosure conversation does proceed in a certain direction. And maybe the argument that they've told themselves is that they'll eventually get there, and that they need to sort of do this multi-decade process of kind of social conditioning and sort of foaming the runway, so to speak. But at any given point, though, along that path, it's a very convenient sort of rationalization, which is society ready for it? And if that's just a bunch of the same white dudes in suits meeting in the same skiffs, right, asking the same sort of question every 10, 20 years, they're implicitly saying, do we want to give up what amounts to like an asymmetry of knowledge, which is usually what translates into an asymmetry of power? And those people throughout history usually don't typically give that up. And that's where I think you reach a point of contention, and I think where we need to shift the logic there. Now I think there's a much different driver of this, and I think those justifications don't hold anymore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've seen some momentum, especially you mentioned earlier the National Defense Authorization Act. We've seen some really good things kind of being proposed in the last few years, but it seems to keep getting shot down. Do you think now with Trump back in power and, we've got people like Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel at the FBI and Ratcliffe and Rubio in these new sort of senior positions, that we may be in a better position to see some further momentum coming up?
That's my expectation, certainly. And the context for this is those individuals, obviously, I think have strong personal views and their own personal history, right, and engaging with this subject matter, whether it's in their formal positions, right, whether it was Radcliffe or Rubio, but also Waltz when he was a congressman, and Tulsi, I think, in a personal capacity. But there's a larger, I think, structural dynamic at play in our political economy, you could say. Elon is now going around and, essentially doing a sort of a postmodern American version of what you could call perestroika, right? Where the institutional system that has been in place for decades is being systematically, you could say, from one perspective, reformed. From another perspective, you could say, like, purged. And the Soviet experience with this sort of process, where you had kind of a loose alliance of oligarchs, some of the rising sort of new sort of outside sort of counter elite or counter institutionalists, had an alliance with some subset of their version of the deep state, the KGB, et cetera, to kind of depose the existing regime, which was an alliance of kind of the nomenclatura and the intelligentsia inside the sort of what was then kind of the decaying kind of Soviet apparatus. And that process led to this massive restructuring of the Soviet sort of political system, institutional system, massive privatizations, right? Like sort of the state massively shrunk, and to try to justify that kind of very radical breakdown of the existing political structure, there was glasnost, right, which was about opening up. Right, that we need to pin sort of the blame on all things going wrong on the previous regime, and so we're going to sort of selectively disclose, all the horrors and crimes of the previous regime as a way to kind of like clean the decks, right, and also then kind of then be able to point to, say, the security organs after this process and say, well, they're good now, right? They're clean. We've removed all the remnants of the past regime, the deep state, yada yada. Now they're good. Now they're loyal, et cetera, to the new state. Right. This is not just the Soviet example. Like lots of political systems have gone through this type of process. So I could see the UAP thing being a part of this. Right. You can sort of couch it. Right. I think the Luna, I call it the sort of postmodern version, because there's a sense of this is all. There's a version which is very, very structural and real and highly significant and strategic. But there's also an element of it that's it's social media, and it's imagistic, and it's mimetic. And it's somewhat contrived and done, with an air of almost like sort of showmanship and frivolity and politicization. And that makes it very hard to sort of grasp, right? Like you have all things happening at once, right? And so you have the American version of this, right? Which isn't necessarily going to be, what we think is everyone wearing ties and suited up and being very somber and serious and apolitical and neutral, et cetera. It's going to be, our version, which is unfortunately kind of this hyper politicized funhouse mirror of perestroika and glasnost that we're going through. And so that's why you can't just look at the UAP question and the disclosure question like in a vacuum, right? And you can see it, right? It's obviously thrown into the mix with everything to do with COVID origins, JFK, RFK, MLK assassinations, the whole litany of suspicions and, quote, conspiracies associated with American history, recent and long past. And this is a lot, right, to try to get your arm around, because, well, I mean, in my view, right, all these topics are important and of historical significance, but like obviously like the UAP one is, I think, of like a relatively, maybe absolutely much larger order of magnitude of significance, and maybe not as inherently political as some of these other ones. But it just, it just is what it is, right? I don't have the master plan. Like no one's put me in charge of anything. So it is what it is. And it's important though to like keep focus and keep pressure on our representatives to ensure that they don't get distracted by whatever the political football of the day is, right? Like the course truth about the nature of non-human intelligences interacting with humanity, the nature of the technology that we have in our possession that we've been trying to reverse engineer to some, ambiguous degrees of success. Like that's the ballgame, guys. Like that's the question we need to have a serious public conversation about. And it can't just be about daddy government giving it to you. It has to be about civil society meeting the government with a demand, and with institutions and sense making and funding and organizations that are prepared to take that step. And so that's kind of my focus on this. So I think the Trump administration, right, there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot of moving parts. My general expectation is more disruption, more change, the magnitude of what could be changed, both from a, not just on this subject, but on a lot of different, domains, more traditional geopolitical or macroeconomical, are quite wide, right? The aperture of the policy space is wider than I think it's ever been in recent history. So it makes it very hard to predict or forecast, right, how the UAP topic is going to navigate that, because almost by assumption, it is of the most strategic, import. And so I don't see how one can make a prediction about the path of disclosure and not also try to conjoin that with some prediction about, well, what is our U.S., China, Russia geopolitical relationship, going to be? What's the relationship with OPEC, right? Like, if there are disruptive energy technologies associated with this, well, that's going to be majorly destabilizing to the geopolitical order. That's going to be, if there's a technological surprise associated with the U.S. adversary or with some other of our capabilities that needs to be, hinted at, well, that's going to change the strategic balance or perception of the strategic balance between these rivals that are now contesting the global order. So there's no way you can just stay in your UAP bubble anymore, right? And just sort of track that progression of that conversation. Now we're entering a new regime where it's a variable that is now linked to other these strategic variables. And I don't know if there's someone in the White House who's like, there's a lot of different, I'd say, cooks in that kitchen, right? Like, you've got traditional demarcations of agency responsibilities. I don't know if one person has been tapped with like, you're the UAP guy, and that sounds like, oh yeah, that's just like, I deal with the drones issue, right? And then you realize, oh wait, actually that touches everything, right? There's no way you could just be the UAP guy without also effectively having the State Department, without also having Treasury, without also having defense and intel. Effectively, it affects the whole portfolio of the federal government and then everybody else. So it's a very difficult problem for our executive agencies to handle, because it doesn't fit in any particular silo. And then you can appoint, a UAP czar, and I think that's, something that's being discussed, right? I think there's folks that are being considered for such a role, but I don't think they're going to be like, and I think they can't really be given like the carte blanche authority over all of these different areas, right? But you need to sort of help pull together and act as a coordinating function across these different agencies, just to get the different arms and legs of the government to at least talk to each other. But the government moves slowly, and the government usually doesn't come to a quick resolution on even pretty simple things, right? It's like, we're gonna write a report in 6 months, right? Let alone like, okay, what does that mean for humanity, right? And this is where I think we should set our expectations about the government. Just tell us essentially what someone I was recently speaking to is like, not disclosure, but like affirmation. Just affirm the truth of the proposition that non-human intelligence is real. Just kind of just sort of tickle that one line, and then let society kind of push the next step.
I suppose in a similar vein to what we've just been talking about is this new declassification task force headed by Luna, and Comer was there, and a lot of people were really kind of positive with that announcement. But then with it not having direct subpoena powers, and then Comer saying, well, he has subpoena powers, that put a lot of people off. So we kind of got two sort of different sides to the outcome of of that announcement. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's a positive? Do you think it has potential, or is it really just not looking great?
I mean, it's a good step given the situation that we have. I would prefer such an entity be a select committee, and I prefer it to be to span the intelligence and armed services committees. And it's also kind of somewhat odd to have the oversight committee representing essentially the majority party that controls the White House, talking about subpoena authority to the executive branch, which is, like, are they going to really pressure Trump to do anything he doesn't want to do? Are they going to really like hold his cabinet officials to account, like in the public sphere? I could be surprised, but like I haven't seen the evidence that that's going to happen. So ultimately, what it looks like is it's a mechanism for these different agencies to get information, sort of like front face some information through the legislative branch, right? In a way that maybe they can't do themselves, right? Like maybe it's like they would love to declassify these sorts of things, but their internal processes for declassification, right? They have to kind of, they could be stymied, right, by certain bureaucrats inside the system, and getting things to say, Trump can always declassify anything he wants, but there's a lots of different layers of the bureaucracy, right? Whereas maybe this is a way of essentially kind of trying to short circuit some of that, and providing a mechanism for, if DOD has some stuff, if DNI has some stuff, the agency has some stuff, et cetera, that they can sort of just hot potato it over to this task force. And then, sort of the task force is then the mechanism by which some of it gets released. But I think it's hard to say like how much the details have been thought through, right? I mean, I think obviously Luna cleared this with the White House. They wouldn't be doing it without that. But also it was announced before, some of these cabinet officials were even confirmed, or around the same time. And so, you just got Tulsi in there at DNI. These folks are going to take some time to like get the briefings, to get a sense of, and I think there's been lots of people leaving these agencies at all levels. So there's a lot of flux at the staffing level. And I when I think about these things, I try to model like the bureaucracy, the people sitting in their offices, going to get the read-ins at the various SCIFs. And if 20% of the workforce has just quit or been fired, it's like, well, that guy that normally does that isn't out, and we have to assign a detailee from this other organization. He's got to pack up his stuff from this office. Like, there's a lot. You'd be surprised how much like the frictions of just the basic mechanisms of bureaucracy can sort of delay what would otherwise be, pretty straightforward things. So I'm like optimistic. I want to be optimistic. I want to give the benefit of the doubt to folks that, want to try to hold folks accountable and to, perform their constitutional responsibilities to bring information to the public that the public has a right to know. So I never want to like, be the peanut gallery, just poo-pooing everything because it doesn't fit the way I would particularly want it to be organized. So cautious optimism, but I'm also realistic that this isn't just going to be a completely nonpartisan thing, right? And that is somewhat of the challenge, because I don't think the UAP subject, is inherently a partisan subject, right? I think it affects every person, every human being, whatever your political stripe is, and I think its significance, ideally would help people recognize a need to kind of stand above the normal sort of tribal divisions we have, but maybe that's a bit of a stretch goal.
I mean, I suppose time will tell. Ultimately, it's really hard, isn't it, to say. But yeah, now I want to talk about the ongoing drone conversation. We had the FAA saying that this is all approved research drones, and it's not gone down very well, that statement. I mean, how do you see it? We've had some people in quite senior positions, and maybe within the legacy programs, people like Jake Barber, who we'll get onto in a little bit as well, saying that he believes that there's an NHI element to some of this as well. How are we supposed to look at this drone situation?
Yes. Again, this is where the signal and the noise ratio is like very especially off kilter. And like and I've sort of tried to piece together the puzzle pieces. And I know for a fact that there were extremely advanced capabilities deployed to New Jersey and surrounding areas to try to get a handle on the situation. This wasn't dismissed as just a pure flight of fancy on social media. Like, the U.S. government at the highest levels did commit resources. At the time, President Biden specifically had 3 different calls with the Secretary of Defense about it. So the machinery of government moved, and the federal government, not just them, but like state and local governments. And I think what happened is, a scenario you could paint is that there was some anomalous activity as like the catalyst, right? Truly, anomalous activity. People are like, what is that, right? What looks like a classic UFO flap, right, that we've seen throughout the 20th century and up until present day. But the particular circumstances of this event sort of then triggered a whole bunch of responses, right, by state and local governments, and by the federal government to sort of deploying people. And I think some of the people they deployed and capabilities they deployed were, themselves somewhat secret. And so you have this kind of, when people say show up and they say I'm from the FBI, and then you ask for their badge and they go, oh, actually I'm not, like I don't have a badge on me. Like people are like, what are you doing here, bro? And like, what's that in the back of your black SUV? And like, what is? So I think there's a lot that then gets mixed in that draws suspicion, that feels like there's, and I think what has happened is that because it was basically just a mess, right? Where like everyone was kind of self-deploying, like everyone's scrambling, responding to executive like intent. And so, hey, I got a toy, I'll send it up there. And so you've got people from the DoD, people from the intelligence community, people from law enforcement, all just kind of like swarming and trying to be secret about it. And it just basically is a mess. It causes more confusion. Probably like public statements were made that were probably not actually true. I think we've seen that, where just different parts of the government were not clued into what was happening. And it was just, basically typical just goat rodeo. And I think from the perspective of the incoming White House that looks back at this, is they're like, oh man, this was a complete mess. And if there was this sort of core non-human intelligence kind of catalyst to it, drawing attention to that and then the government's sort of just shambolic response is not like a way you want to start the NHI conversation off. You don't want to broach in the public discussion like the reality of NHI by like pointing to like where everybody just collectively fumbled the ball on the field, right? For weeks on end. It doesn't exactly imbue the confidence that you as the new executive want to like project. So I think there's a collective decision, which is, okay, we're not going to dismiss the reality of the subject, but like that New Jersey thing, that's not really maybe the best place that we want to start, right? Let's just sort of try to pretend that didn't happen and like, let that recede into memory, and then hopefully have a better, a more solid footing to start the next, public official place for this conversation. But yeah, I mean, I know some folks that were out there that were deploying advanced capabilities, counter US capabilities, et cetera. And saw things that are anomalous, right, from the perspective of professionals in this area. In the sense that it would register on certain sensors, but on other sensors, staying aloft for a long period of time, very, non-traditional, just like hobbyist drones or commercial planes or, sort of the typical air clutter. So that's, and of course there was lots of stuff happening around the country. And of course, we had the RAF incidents here. So this is New Jersey, I think, was a particularly fraught kind of ball of wax where everything was just kind of thrown in. And so it was very hard to then suss out like what was what. But then you have these other circumstances, right? You have, Lincoln Heath, you have folks out, you have some related issues out at West, I think Pax River. So it's clearly not like a one-off. But yeah, I don't think we're going to get like a good solid answer to what was really happening there. I think the government was just, it's a good example of this, right? It's like there I think are left-hand, right-hand issues on all of these things. And when you have an incident like this and you don't have a defined SOP, the government responds to normal stuff like a disaster or, a terrorist attack. The government has spent years sort of honing playbooks and deployment and capabilities and, communications protocols from, the federal government all the way down to the state and local governments. And they practice these things, they rehearse them, they do exercise. I facilitated, designed, I did a lot of those exercises early in my career. And, because it's complicated. You've got hundreds of people, thousands of people all moving around. You got special assets, you got different levels of classification, you got things you need to say to the public, maybe things you don't want to say to the public. It takes a lot of coordination. And it's, even in the best of cases where you have, the time to plan and sort of practice, things go wrong. And so when you just do this on the fly for a subject that you've almost intentionally, put one arm behind your back, right? For half of the government or most of the government doesn't really know this is real. Then you just get what I think we saw, which was just a kind of a clown show.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you go back a little further, you look at the 2019 swarms over the Navy ships off the West Coast, with the Omaha, with the video that Jeremy Corbell got his hands on and released. And then you look at Langley, I think towards the end of 2023, I believe, you'd think that by 2024, when these incidents occurred in New Jersey, that someone within government or military or IC would have a hold on this and not allow this to keep continuing to happen. I mean, where does it stop? That's what I think a lot of people are so bemused by.
I mean, yes, I think there's a sense in which it's, you have the like bemusement, But there's also a very serious national security issue here, like where I think our adversaries were studying that response and we're taking note of it and noting that, oh, actually, I can potentially push the envelope in, say, my espionage activities or even my pre-operational sabotage activities, which we know the Russians and the Chinese are very aggressive at, using their own particular, means and methods. But they are very advanced. They both have their own special capabilities. And at the end of the Biden administration into the Trump administration, I think they were like, let's push. Maybe we could push the envelope here. And so, I think that accounts for all the apparent observed phenomena, but it adds in, a more sort of prototypical counterespionage dynamic here, and that was, my other hat, right, which is doing kind of cyber counterintelligence sorts of stuff, is a huge issue, right? We are sort of somewhat overmatched when it comes to just the counterintelligence problem domestically. And the government never likes to admit vulnerabilities and never likes to look like they don't have their full handle on the situation, especially when it comes to airspace defense over sensitive facilities. Not something that the government's going to just pony up to. It's just the nature of their beast.
I mean, some people have even sort of speculated that if it is a foreign adversary, that's like the majority of these drones represent, that there could be they could be utilizing a technology that we're not fully aware of, that maybe they have cracked something that is enabling people to mistake them for UAP, for genuine, like, anomalous objects. Do you see that as a potential?
Yeah, I'd say that's more likely than not, in my opinion. Not necessarily in the New Jersey case itself. I have no specific information about that. But just in general, I think one of the motivations or drivers for kind of this recent disclosure era has been the recognition that, foreign technology surprise, right? And if you just look at the Chinese system in particular, I can sort of tell a story, and it's sort of, I'd say it's partially informed by high quality information, but it's me kind of stitching together a narrative that essentially is, China from the 70s on was essentially a little brother to the United States, especially from the intelligence and military side. I mean, President Biden himself was the one who negotiated kind of this agreement with Deng to sort of in place jointly monitored sort of SIGINT and MASIC collection systems in Northwest China. Northwest trying to replace the stations we lost in the Arbor's Mountains after the Iranian Revolution. And of course, there was a Sino-Soviet split. So China was kind of, we had the mutual objective of monitoring Russia's advanced missiles and other weapons tests in Siberia, et cetera. And so I think if there was say a crash retrieval program at the time, I suspect, strongly that there was. China's a big place. Western Siberia, Eastern Siberia is a big place. If we're aware of this sort of covert sub-rosa arms race to retrieve, fallen objects, then it would be very important to establish like essentially a franchise of that retrieval program in China, effectively. And the fact that they were completely subservient to us, like very poor, very backward from a technological state standpoint, gave us a lot of leverage, and we could effectively co-opt and kind of own the different onion layers leading to this core kind of, say, franchise of the retrieval program. And you can imagine that evolving with Chinese and U.S. politics over the decades to the point where Xi comes into power, 2013, 2014, and there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of okay, he said some things, but he'll be a friend to the West. And then he immediately starts locking things down, and purges, start kicking off throughout the military, right? And in particular, start hitting the rocket forces, which cover the nuclear program and all these other sort of strategic programs. And you can imagine a scenario where he starts cracking skulls all the way down these different ranks until he basically hits the folks that are effectively working for the U.S. government, right? Running the franchise, of the U.S. program, and is like, oh, this is interesting. I need to take this over now. And then it's like, oof, right? And now it's China's. And that maybe the U.S. kind of realizes that 2014, 2015 is like, we have a problem. And then they start crashing lots of resources, China does, into their military modernization, massive expansion of the rocket forces, their ICBM program, their naval. And now, like, the alarms start going off in the rest of the U.S. military intelligence system that China is now, has ambitions, right? 2025, or the main China 2025 program, provocative actions in Taiwan. Like, they're not just going to be little brother, little partner anymore. They want to be, a peer competitor to us. And of course, the whole point is like you need to be a technological competitor, especially in advanced, military and intelligence capabilities. And the rest of the U.S. intelligence system that starts to then acutely monitor all the Chinese military research activities, and tracks leading rocket scientists and physicists and engineers, and figures out which buildings they're working in and where they're moving. Maybe they start to pick up on a lot of like anomalous things happening, right? Like new facilities being built out in the desert, right? A whole bunch of people that were working over here that now just disappear, right? The like the cream of the crop coming out of the like leading Chinese universities, they just disappear in certain, say, physics domains, right? Or advanced engineering domains that draw a lot of attention. And this starts to become an issue for the U.S. legacy program, because now there are other people right down the hall from them, so to speak, in the U.S. intelligence community that are like writing these assessments, classified assessments of suspicions that China is crashing a lot of money and people and resources into some unknown project, right? And it happens to connect to some really anomalous areas, right? That and RFIs start going around like, are we doing this too? Like, do we have? And of course, the kind of water cooler wink would raise suspicions that actually we do have these programs. But now this is not something that the legacy programs can kind of just keep as their own special little thing, right? Anymore. Now it gets elevated. Now folks like Ratcliffe have to get briefed, because it's not just that. It's also, well, the Tic Tac stuff. It's also these high fidelity radar sort of multi-signature detections of anomalous objects coming in and out of space and going under the water, et cetera. And this starts to then become something you can't put back in the bottle here. And now we get to the present day where that trajectory of China's technological modernization has now reached a point where they're potentially matched, if not exceeded, in certain areas, because they could have just crashed 10 times as many people, 10 times as many resources, and done basically sort of a go for broke approach. And that would be a wake up call for the U.S. and basically saying the last 80 years of the approach to secrecy no longer cuts it. We need to sort of freshen the talent pool. We need to broaden awareness of historic exotic technology antecedents. And we can only really do that by accepting, that this is going to get out. And so then we need to parallel that with kind of a soft disclosure process at the same time. So that's kind of my TLDR of like what I think is, one process that's underway. There probably are others as well, but it seems not implausible to me that that's part of the explanation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that so much. And let's just stick with crash retrievals, because we obviously had the recent Jake Barber story, with this crash retrieval team that he alleged to have worked on, and that then went even further and started talking about these psionic abilities. And so it's really getting to this crazy sounding story. And, it kind of, I think a lot of people in the community are still trying to understand how to deal with this kind of information. How do you see that? What I suppose, you've got your physics hat when you put that on, but also a philosophical hat. And how do you kind of pull all these things together to try and begin to make sense of it?
Yeah, and so in the interest of full transparency, I've just recently come on as a outside advisor to Skywatcher and Enya. So I have a formal relationship with them. So I just want to be clear about what I say, right, is not just me pontificating, but I've now have a formal connection with them. So everything I say, right, should be interpreted in that light. And I'm being brought in to help kind of frame out, at least from my perspective, kind of a larger strategy, right, associated with these efforts here. I'm certainly probably the least qualified person involved in that group. But I've come to know Jake and some of the other folks involved, and I only got involved, seriously, professionally, essentially, part-time, because I think that they have, the bona fides that they do have, and they're very serious and acting in good faith, I think, in their efforts here, and want to do it the right way and do it in a way that's transparent and accountable, right? So I've tried to do, my due diligence on everything to take that step, which I haven't done before, and anything UAP related, really, up to this time. And so my opinion is informed by that. Is that I think it's a unique initiative, somewhat necessary, and kind of goes back to my earlier point, which is the government's in a difficult spot, I think, from their their organization, institutional inertia, and a lot of the other organizations that you might call like parastatal organizations around the federal government, like these well-established think tanks like RAND, for example, that you would typically look to, and the government would sort of look to kind of help bridge them to, say, frontier technology, to do sort of risk assessments, and to help kind of front door some policy conversations because of the taboo and the stigma. Like those organizations are just kind of, they're not there. They're not ready. They're just not having that conversation. They're not caught up really. And that's a problem for the government, because they're like the normal ways they would do it, right? You would have a panel, you'd bring all the, public and private people together. You'd be at Rand or Brookings or CSIS, and you'd have these, people in suits sitting on a panel discussion, and you'd have like UAP disclosure, right? Like policy risks and technology opportunities, and you'd have white papers, and you have folks like the Soul Foundation that have, very admirably been doing that, kind of filling that void. But again, they can only do so much, and they're a new organization, and they're not like Rand has, I think, a $500 million endowment, right? Like these are just not the same things. And so I reckon that it's a real problem in the sense that for the magnitude of the topic, because it's been so tabooed and shrouded in secrecy, like the civil society institutions and private sector institutions that would otherwise and already exist in other topics, like don't exist, like completely, they're super nascent. And so, and the government, therefore, doesn't necessarily like its normal muscle movements that it does when it wants to like push to the next conversation, or, broaden and say, take a technology out of the classified domain and start to try to do the tech transfer stuff. Those are very immature and not well formulated, right? And so that, I think, means there's a massive gap to be filled on the private sector and civil society side to build institutions, build nonprofits that essentially take this seriously, and that can sort of act as a catcher's mitt in some respects, but also a bridge builder to the government. And the government is a mixed and messy beast, right? There are the certain subsets, right? Sort of cleared contractors and maybe a small number of individuals inside the government that, maybe have some explaining to do, and, some accountability that needs to be brought to bear. But there's a lot of other folks in the government that they're waking up to this themselves. And they want to know, and they want to do things maybe a better and different way and do things in a bit more of a transparent and accountable fashion. So it's kind of this kind of shake the Etch-a-Sketch, right? Let's start this off. But to your point about the psionics thing, right? This is where it's even more difficult for the government, because I think you can see kind of two tracks being laid, right? One track you could say is like the Age of Disclosure documentary track. Very serious officials of high stature, sort of significant rank, names that are recognized by most people that, pay attention to security conversations, coming out and sort of in no ambiguous terms stating the reality of non-human intelligence. Even, Jay Stratton coming out and saying he saw bodies and non-human craft. Again, kind of the ratchet of the official sort of conversation, getting to that critical next, juncture. And then you have the separate track kind of happening, I think, more organically from the bottom up, right? Like Jake and his colleagues, as he mentioned, like he's the fingertips, right? He's the frontline guy doing sort of the dirty work, right? You could say. He's I take my instructions, I do the mission, right? You tell me where to be, what to do, I'll do it. But he's not a strategy policy guy that gets in these, cloistered rooms and sets out like the timetable for disclosure. He's just like, I've been doing this thing. I had a very radical personal experience that I can't explain away, and that is confirmed by a lot of other folks that are involved. And then he's seen how these operations like look and work up close, right? And he's, prepared now to essentially reproduce some of those, maybe in a better way now in the private sector, but where you don't have the baggage that maybe the legacy programs have, and you can do things a bit more in the public domain, right? And I think that's a critical thing. Is like, I was like, the Skywatcher thing is kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if you do it in the public domain, like everything, you film it, you do these sort of episodes to try, people are like, oh, this is just a grift. They're just trying to like do Skinwalker Ranch, yada, 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 right? Like they're showing too much, right? There's like, don't show me everything you're doing, right? But if they didn't do that, if they're just like a privately funded crash retrieval operation, and just sort of word leaks out through like the podcast grapevine that there's some bunch of tier 1 special mission unit guys going and doing psionic retrievals, I guarantee people be like, well, that's like red flag, right? flag. And so I think the only way is to have this happen in the public domain. But because it's such a radically new thing, like the public, I'd say, median conversation, like, is used to getting these ratchets, right? And it's like, I think a similar thing with the Grush, right, was before Grush testified, like there was sort of this inching up to retrieval discussions. This idea of like crash retrievals was kind of like, ooh, if you said that in a podcast, you'd be kind of like you'd be testing the waters, right? Let alone if you said bodies, right, or like pilots, that would be biologic was like no go. And then he did it, and it was like a nonlinear jump in the conversation, right? and I think this is another nonlinear jump in the conversation, but I think the other conversations always end up catching up, right? And so this is, I think, showing where this is heading. But there's no master, I think, coordinator of any of this. And I go back to my physics and philosophy hat, and I go, well, just because we have these sort of folk mental models about reality that you studied high school physics, and you're like, all right, this is just a sort of a space time that we're all sort of bouncing around in, and there's matter particles and fields, and then there's brains like us that evolve through this complicated process of evolution. And it's a material metaphysics that sort of is usually the presupposition behind that folk physical model. And that's what most people go through their lives with. And then maybe they have their separate sort of more spiritual set of beliefs that are almost disconnected from a scientific naturalistic framework, where they learn that in their religious traditions. And I come from an orientation that's like nature is nature. Nature is whatever it is, and we are just trying to develop models of reality, and we have to then create usually radically different conceptual frameworks. Every so often, like our paradigm shifting relative to the set that have gotten us to a certain stage of understanding, and the sort of the mental models that we develop for, say, materialist physics are going to have to break. Now, it doesn't mean just retreat into sort of wooey new age kind of I believe I can achieve sorts of stuff, right? I think nature is nature. It's governed by certain regulative principles. And you want to develop a process of conceptual development that stretches to reach, under that sort of a gap in your understanding. And I think that's where the UAP, NHI question is so difficult, is because it's the center point at which all these different things converge, like breakthrough physics, that we don't really understand the nature of reality, right? You don't understand quantum gravity, for example, and different degrees of freedom that we can technologically exploit and develop devices to exploit. That's seemingly what the craft represent. We also don't understand consciousness. We understand the qualitative, subjective, first-person nature of existence and how that's consistent with a physical, model of reality. And yet the UAP object sort of they're like the particle accelerator for those two different, core existential questions, right? Like their craft that obey some, immensely advanced set of, that operate on, immensely advanced sort of physical sort of engineering principles and understanding of physics that we don't have. But they're also apparently able to engage directly and be engaged with directly through manifestations of human consciousness or patterns of human sort of mental states. And that to me is just okay, as an intellectual question, that's what I was doing since I was in high school. I was like, how do they put these things together? Philosophy of mind, at frontiers of theoretical physics. And then I talked to some guys that are like, oh yeah, we retrieve these objects and we use these, individuals that have these enhanced psionic abilities to sort of vector these craft in, and they sort of, engage in kind of this, link. I mean, for most people that would be sort of wooey, crazy, almost schizophrenic, right? For me, I'm like, oh, that's really intriguing data, right? People I want to see the data, right? I want to see that, and I think that's why that's what sort of tipped me over to sort of to now officially help with Skywatcher, is because that's, I think, such a fascinating thing, and I think it needs to just let's just do it, right? If someone wants to pony up and do these operations and start collecting high fidelity data, enough of the I can come on a podcast and keep spewing, but that's only going to do so much. You need to have imagery, you need to have radar, you need to have all these multi-sensor confirmations, you need to document everything, you need to do it, repeatedly, get the, and then show your work. And then people can judge, right? By the, I think even Jake said it, judge us by the fruits, right? We're going to try it, right? We'll see what happens. So I admire that sort of just the cojones to just do that. I'm like, all right, I can't know that and be like, all right, I'm just going to sit on the sidelines there. Right? That's a pretty cool thing. I can't do a lot, but at least I'll help to the extent that I can. So I'm really excited about it. And we'll see what happens. Right. I have no predictions about what's going to happen.
No, I agree. I think that's really great. It's great news that you're involved. And again, I sort of mirror those sentiments that, let them do what they plan to do, and then the public can judge on the results that they bring forward. So no, that's great. In there you mentioned this upcoming documentary, The Age of Disclosure, which looks fantastic. And I have to ask, this statement you made recently or a few months ago about this coup d'etat, was that related directly to The Age of Disclosure and some of the people involved with that?
Yes, yeah. So that was, I think when I said that was last summer or spring, and I had gotten first word of the individuals that had been interviewed for that documentary and the things that might have been said. And so when I put those two together, I was like, all right, well, that's very good to be a different thing when that comes out. And so, yeah, that was a prediction based off of what I thought was the release date for that documentary. And I think, yeah, that documentary will be very significant when it comes out. Again, for me, disclosure is the sort of process of social sense making and different parts of the population updating their credences as they take seriously, the probability associated with the reality of non-human intelligence, and to have, very senior people come out and all en masse essentially say like these are like real phenomena. Whether I don't think we wake up the next morning, everyone going like, oh yeah, that must be true, right? But I think I think it'll be a very significant moment that like, okay, folks will have to pay attention to. And it's fascinating because I've also had conversations with, mainstream media, you could say, over the past like year or two, right? A lot of folks will talk to me on background just to try to ask me, the questions that, they're trying to ask, like, what's really going on here? Like, what do you think what's up with this? And so I've had conversations with a number of reporters. I think most of them acting in good faith, I think, right? And I've recognized, I think Ross is right to point out kind of the lickspittle reporters, as he calls them, right? And most of those folks, I think, are the folks that are like staffing the Pentagon, briefing rooms, or, the White House, where they're just they're writing copy for the day. These are not investigative reporters. They are sort of tasked by their editors to like get the headline, whatever that news cycle is, and to sort of spit it back, right, within 2 hours, right? So these are not the people that you would, I think, reasonably expect to like spend their free time digging into hundreds of hours of UAP podcasts and reading these books and interviewing. To really do this, you have to like. I spoke with one reporter who's writing a long piece on this for a mainstream outlet, and I spent 6 months interviewing 60 plus people for this story, and I think they're operating in good faith. I think they started off, with not much knowledge, and are now like, if you spend 6 months interviewing 60 people, right? And I think talking to most people that we know, right, in this area, you come away with, I think, a very different opinion of the significance and the implications of what's happening than I think you would start with. I think the challenge is, though, those people often end up very, very far from where their editors are, right? As like, imagine, you go down this rabbit hole and then you come up, at Thanksgiving, and you try to give like okay, give me the 30-minute bluff about what you found, or what you learned. And it's like, yeah, crash retrieval, psionics, right? Multiple species, right? AI, time travel, crypto terrestrial, like, it's like, whoa. We asked you to write like a nice little summary piece. It's like, I think it very quickly, like the problem that I see is that I've had this conversation with other reporters, is like, they're personally interested in the subject matter. They want to write about it, but it's like, they're kind of caught because the UFO conversation, you could say, has moved so far from where maybe like the median editor, right, is, that when they try to write a story, it either looks like just pathetically out of date, like they're sort of summarizing kind of the banal stuff of like NDAA, Arrow reports, right? Because they just can't even touch let alone the Grush stuff, let alone the Jacob Barber stuff, and that means they're kind of, I'd say, paralyzed, like they're just kind of stuck. And maybe that'll break, right? Maybe, I think what they need, honestly, right, they need like a household name to kind of like the water's warm, and then maybe that will like allow them to sort of attempt to catch up. But I think even then, it's probably going to be somewhat too late for a lot of these organizations. Just institutionally, organizationally, they're not oriented to that. It's unfortunate. And I think it's why podcasts like yourselves and other podcasts, this is where these conversations are happening, because there isn't that, or institutional resistance or kind of lag, right? There's just, it's almost, sometimes it's the opposite. They're too obsessed with whatever's on the frontier that sometimes you forget what happened, right? Like, I actually was going back and re-listening to Tom DeLonge, like Coast to Coast, interviews that he did with George Knapp, the one that I think he was kind of slapped around by his like the general or whatever. But you go back to that and you're like, he kind of was saying this stuff back then. He was talking about, CE5 and anti-gravity research, and, like he was just laying it out there. Right. And I think, back then, like even the UAP conversation was not prepared to like take that on. Like the median person listening to this was just like, whoa, Tom is off his rocker. He's talking about all this zany stuff. Like he must be a vector for disinformation. His generals are just using him to like pollute the conversation. But I think if you look back on it, where it was 6-7 years later, it's kind of like where we are now. And yeah, I just think, everyone has to kind of do that like self-assessment. Like, what are my biases? Where's my no-go zone, right? Like whatever the thing is that you're probably resistant to at this moment is probably going to be the thing you're going to be forced to reckon with in like 6 months. And I don't know, I've just sort of I've now had to do that cycle of like hitting the Overton window or hitting the Overton wall a few times, and then seeing that window open or that wall crumble, that I'm like, all right, well, the next time that happens, I should just expect it to change. And try to keep myself still anchored in some rational principles, right? Like evidence, data, high fidelity, like not speculation, but like, okay, multi-source corroboration for certain things. And but I personally now at this point of it's less about the reality of the phenomenon or even like the trajectory of our technology, which is important. It's more about like the more pressing risk in my mind is if we are at this sort of what I think we are close to is this, I wouldn't call it like an inflection point, but a phase transition in social understanding of this topic in its many different manifestations. That requires, and this is back to my earlier point, it requires civil society to have the institutions and, at all levels, right? Like, friend conversations all the way to like, the RAND for UAPs or like an ecosystem of venture capital for this, right? We need to have like all the different parts of our civil society, our economic system, and our political system, take it seriously and, start to prepare for, right, a potential radical transformation of a lot of these areas. And it's been really encouraging to hear folks like Ann Brady Estevez, for example, who's been leading a lot of these conversations from the National Science Foundation. And she'd been convening these, panel discussions and sort of, I think it was sort of task force or sort of working groups with folks from across the federal government and doing these public like webinars where it's just accepting the reality of UAPs and the, prospect of radical technological transformation, and that the government needs to like get on board with catalyzing public investment in these things and seeding, private garage inventors and big primes to bring, energy and new materials and space technologies, to the fore. And, she did a big like 9-hour webinar with like all of these co-chairs from Space Force, from NASA, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. And the keynote or like opening that she gave had like the gun camera footage of whether it was Go Fast or Gimbal, and then Mike Gold from NASA gave his sort of summary of David Grush's testimony, and then they just launched into a guy from Space Force talking, and the guy, it was just like, this is just a public, like that to me is sort of what disclosure looks like, right? It's not the president going to the Rose Garden and being like, my fellow Americans, the people from space, they're here, but don't worry, we got it under control, right? It's going to be, these more kind of mid-level bureaucracies, like all of a sudden having that preference cascade where they don't have to falsify their beliefs anymore, and they just sort of start acting as if it's true. And it's you almost like you never get that like disclosure moment. You just quickly go from like denial, like pretend it's not happening, to like, oh yeah, of course this is real, right? And then we're gonna like start doing normal government programs around it, right? We're gonna fund research. And like, what, you didn't get that? You didn't get the memo that it's real? Oh yeah, well, like it is, yeah. So like, let's move on, right? I think they want to just kind of like, it's like when you have a kid, you give them a shot, right? You kind of just like, it just happened, right? Don't worry, right? It's now, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Like now we're gonna focus on the next thing. So anyways, I don't have a clear plan or like vision of how that plan is going to unfold, but it's clear that this is now going to become central to a lot of these policy conversations in the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, there is some concern in the UFO community I've noticed of late of these materials and craft or whatever getting into the hands of the so-called tech bros. You know, a lot of people are worried about that they're just going to monetize it and that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's always a concern when you see people purely motivated by money, right? And I think, profit is a powerful incentive here. And so I always look for people that are motivated, like they have to incorporate capital into their model, because if you're just doing it out of the goodwill, you're not going to get very far, right? But your motivations have to be more than that, right? Your motivations have to be, in my view, in the public interest, right? And with a view towards sharing and collaboration, as opposed to sort of hoarding and sort of exploitation. I think that, to me, this is why I think I am affiliated with Skywatcher. I think that's part of the motivation here, right? Isn't if they want to just get a bunch of spooks and be super secret and never tell anybody and go off and try to collect some things, like they could have done that, right? I mean, there might be people even doing that as we speak. I don't know. But the fact that you have Twitter accounts and YouTube channels is like, all right, well, show me the goods, right? And then once you find the goods, well, then it's a different conversation about how do you structure that, right, in a public way, right? What sorts of new? But this is where it's more than just that. It's like, this is you saw the I think it was at Seoul. I forget who gave the talk about kind of creating an ecosystem around. I think it was Rez, the guy that has the simulation hypothesis. Forgive me, I forget his name.
Oh, yeah, Riz Virk.
Yes, and he gave a really good talk in terms of how would you fund, right, UAPs, right? It sounds like we have a craft profit, right? It's like, I don't think it's as simple as that, right? It's like the Gnome Underpants South Park episode. I think this is a much larger conversation, and much more than like what one company or initiative can really do, right? You're really talking about an entire new ecosystem, and taking existing ecosystems and now reorienting them to these materials and to these branches of the tech tree and scientific paradigms that maybe haven't been in the center of, say, academic or sort of research institutions. And so that's a much larger process, and I think there's only one pieces of this could maybe move first, and the rest of the pieces could sort of catch up quickly. But yeah, I was actually having a conversation with a gentleman. I don't think he's prepared to go public yet, but he's a sort of serial entrepreneur. Very smart guy, done lots of different things, very interested in UAPs. He's not connected to Skywatcher or anything like that. He's just intellectually very interested in it. But he had these ideas for how to catalyze, this is separate from UAPs, but just how to basically bring together a new way of doing sort of techno-scientific, kind of development and innovation that sort of breaks the sort of linear funding model that dominated the 20th century, where you had like government-funded pure research, then government would sort of maybe do some applied at like universities, and then there may be some value of death to do kind of like the take something that could be applied research. Then you have to do the engineering, right? Then you have to say, okay, we've proven out the engineering. Then it's okay, product market fit. Then you have to get funding, right? And then you have to get safe rounds or seed capital. Then you have to go to market. You got to get your Series A, Series B, and then you maybe want to IPO or exit. So there's a whole sort of innovation capital techno ecosystem that we've developed in these other domains, like very successfully with like SaaS software and the internet. Now there's been a rise of sort of deep tech. Obviously, that's what made Elon so rich. But this is sort of frontier tech, if not beyond frontier tech, right? Where normal VC is like the market is the only risk, right? The technology and the science is there. You just need to develop the product and get it to work. And this is basically Riz's talk. And then there's deep tech, which is you need to do some serious engineering work. Science is usually there, right? But you have no idea, really don't know how to do the Raptor engine. You got to build the Raptor engine, right, to get the SpaceX business model to work. And then there's frontier tech, which you need to have like fundamental science breakthroughs, right? Usually this is a lot of biotech. This is a lot of sort of synthetic biology, or even like AI you could consider is at that frontier, right? We don't really know. Like a lot of this is like pure science in terms of these next generation AI models. And the UAP stuff to me is like beyond frontier tech, right? It's like new physics paradigms, right? Like, there's sort of the lore thrown up around extended electrodynamics or other sorts of modifications, like, say Cartan, sort of Einstein modifications to general relativity. I think it'll be very different than that. That's like, those are the tropes of the 20th century. There probably are higher level, those are probably higher level core screening descriptions of the corrections to our models that come from a much deeper physical understanding, where we unify a lot of these different mathematical models of the 20th century into a true theory of quantum gravity, and where space-time is emergent, we get like a radically new framework for things. But you kind of have to do that if you really want to build a UAP, right? Now, there's probably lots of other things you could spin off. Like a lot, I think the first order things may be like in material science, right? If you know there's a certain way of structuring like the lattice of a metamaterial, like, and you know that it maybe gives you some emergent higher level phenomena or properties that are really, really useful in different ways. Well, that's like, okay, fund that, right? So I think there's lots of interesting things that could have a lot of collateral benefit for society. They may have been, snuffed out, right, or jealously guarded by certain defense primes. And so I think we definitely need to broaden awareness of that, but you need to create a whole innovation ecosystem and reorient a lot of existing institutions to this topic. And this is why I think the idea, though, like, okay, the Skywatcher team is not that large, right? And I think like they probably have some special sauce, but I don't think it's that special, right? In the sense that at a certain point, pretty soon, other people could probably do the same thing, right? And so I don't think this idea that like this is fundamentally going to be scarce, like technology or scarce information, right? I think we're just in this these are just the first movers, and I think we'll wake up in a few years and this will not be like there will be much of a moat, I think, around some of this knowledge, right? I think the moat will be around the partnerships, the ecosystem, just how it is in lots of other competitive domains. It's about, okay, like just because you're first doesn't mean you succeed. And also like, what does success mean, right? Like getting rich. Okay. Like, but like the premise of this whole thing is actually a lot more important than that. Right. And I think a lot of people involved are already rich. Right. So it's not like, oh, I just want to get an extra zero. It's like, okay, I think a lot of rich people, I know a lot of rich people from the Bitcoin space, right? And they got to the point where they're, they could just chill out on an island somewhere. It's like, well, okay, what do you do then? Right. All right. Well, you want to know the deep answers to the deepest questions, right? It's like, oh, you could buy another yacht. You could go have another party, or you could go, endow your university, or these other vanity projects that a lot of rich people do. I'm like, well, like if like a, relatively pocket change from like could actually help answer this question, and not just answer, but actually then spawn and catalyze civil society and the private sector to sort of just move beyond, whatever the government was doing, right? And I think between AI and the proliferation of a lot of capabilities that are already in the private sector, it's not like you need, a government lab. You don't need to have, all these compartmentalizations. But I'll put an important proviso here, which is I don't know, right, what I don't know. So there probably are reasons for the secrecy that were just parochial, protecting national security advantage, and that's important. But there might be there is such a thing as dangerous knowledge, right? This is the tension in a democracy, right? It's like if, like, for example, like, if it turned out that nuclear weapons were something that anyone could like 3D print, right, with an internet connection and Amazon orders, then the world would be a very dangerous place, right? If everyone could just do that, then like most cities would not exist, right? Most people would be living very far from each other, and our techno civilization would be dead pretty quickly. And there's nothing like inherent to nature that prevents such knowledge or such technology to exist, right? There could be, apples on that tree that you pluck them and it's like, uh-oh, we have a major proliferation problem. And, this gets back to kind of this more, model of civilization is, being on this sort of filtered path, which is once you get to this point where certain things about nature, you either exploit that and you destroy yourself, or you reached a point of kind of enlightened consciousness and sort of de facto self-constraint as a civilization, that you can leverage that technology for your collective benefit. And you can now essentially uplift your whole civilization, right? And you can become cosmic denizens, so to speak, right? So this is like the test, right? Like you pick out that ball from the that black ball from the jar, and it either kills you or it turns you into cosmic beings. That's a bit maybe a bit of an exaggeration, a bit too philosophical, but it has to be considered here, right? If you're going to embark on this process of trying to retrieve some of these materials and then catalyze in the open, so to speak, a lot of R&D, you have to consider that risk. And then you have to do prudent, planning, and you have to build institutions and norms, right? It's very similar to like the AI conversation, right? I mean, some of it's exaggerated, some of it's driven by a lot of like ulterior motives and trying to get the government to like draw a moat around their around their business, because risk is so significant that only their company can be trusted, right? And so they have to be protected from competition, because we might develop the super AI, and it has to be in our bunker with the government looking over shoulder. And there's been a lot of those conversations about AI safety, alignment, proliferation risk. So it's not a new debate, but I think we'll have to have those conjoined with this larger conversation. And yeah, there's no single answer for it, but it's a mix of public policy, norms, good faith attitudes, and yeah, there's a tension between you can have an arms race dynamic, and you can have healthy capital competition, and those are not the same thing in my mind, right? You can have capital competition that's driven by innovation and competitive advantage, that you have guardrails on, you have moral and ethical norms that are instilled and that are maybe even enforced, right, as a sort of either self-regulatory organizations or the government drawing clear lines. And then you have arms race dynamics. Arms race dynamics are where there is no moral norms, there are no guardrails, and it's just a zero-sum game to whoever gets to the frontier as quickly as possible that gets an overmatch. And that is where you get real risk scenarios in lots of other areas, right? Whether it's nuclear weapons, AI, synthetic biology, proliferation. So I think this is not a new conversation. It's also not unique to the UAP technology exploitation, you could say. So I think there'll be a lot of lessons that you could apply. But I think all of these things are going to have to be put under some new framework, right, that we don't really have yet. And who knows? Maybe we'll get help with that. Maybe that's we're not on our own when it comes to crafting such norms. But then there's a whole nother question about our sovereignty, right, as a species, if that's the case, right? That's maybe a separate conversation, but but yeah, there's a lot there.
There is indeed. I mean, I really appreciate all of your insights. It really, gives me food for thought, and I hope hopefully the audience as well. But I just want to say, Matthew, thank you so much for such an in-depth conversation. I really do appreciate you taking the time. So thank you.
Thanks you. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year.
It is indeed. And as it develops throughout the year, then maybe we'll have you back on and we can update on what's been happening. So I really hope we get this momentum and it sticks. So yeah, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. See you soon.